Okay. How do we get that popped up? I would love to know. Okay. We should be all good now. Just trying to see what I can do. What else I could do on this. Using a completely new program. Okay. Hold on, just give me one quick second, and I will get this up and running. Only because I can't see the stream chat right now. Okay, hold on. Okay. Okay, we should be good now. All good. How do I get that up? That's confusing. That just showed up that it was working. Because it originally showed me I could pull up the stream chat on Streamlabs OBS. But for some reason, it's not gonna work right now. Okay. Oh, that sucks.
I just want for people to really recognize how pure and sweet it really is to be accepted for exactly who you are. In skateboarding, there are
Okay.
people who are still pretty
Gonna wait for a few more people to join the stream. How's everyone doing tonight?
way better. That's what inspired me to create NYCSP. I wanted to create an intentional space for gender non-conforming.
Okay. Let me just quickly get rid of those real fast.
A majority of the time, women and queers don't feel safe in skate spaces, so we create our own. Now is the time to create, and now is the time to share, and now is the time to...
Okay. I just wanted to quickly see if that would work. Okay. We all good. Okay. Let me just quickly see while I'm waiting for people to get on if I can get the chat opened up. I swore I just had it up, which is a little bit obnoxious, but oh, what's up, Steven? Just give me a sec. I'm trying. I had this one thing popped up on Streamlabs OBS. That's the recording software or the streaming software I'm using, but for some reason it's just not working. Okay. Cool. Steven, do you want to, like, just talk on OBS while I do this? Because I'm going to be bored as hell just doing this all by myself. I might even want to die by the end of this. Let me know. Where is the stream chat? Huh. That is bizarre. Yeah, so let me know, do you want to hop on Discord? Maybe we could... Okay, sorry. It just lagged a little bit. That was my fault. It's all good now. When I get my stuff together, I'll hop on. Let me get everything done first. Alright, I got you. Do you ever, like, have your stuff up already? Like, do you just take all your stuff down? Like, your computer stuff? Okay. Online counter, that's ready. Okay. Plus, I'm on a toilet. Ah, well, shit. Well, I do, but I gotta clean up the man cave real quick. Plus, I'm on the toilet. Of course you are. When aren't you? Always just trying to piss me off. One thing I'm very debating on doing is, like, while I'm doing this, if I'm literally debating, I just come with my headphones. If you don't, come on and talk as well, because I'm gonna be bored. Because all I'm gonna be doing is saying StoryFire over and over and over again, just like I did The Earth is Flat over and over again, 10,000 times. I'm saying StoryFire 10,000 times, or until McJuggerNuggets comes on the stream. If he doesn't, then, welp, I'm gonna unsubscribe. So, take that. Okay. Steven, if you don't hurry up, I'm gonna be... Wait, hold on. I'm gonna be on GTA, though. Well, you better be wearing headphones when playing GTA, because I don't want to hear that shit. Got that? Only because, like, I want to at least, like... Because I'm no matter what, I'm still going to be saying StoryFire 10,000 times, but I still want to at least, like, talk to the stream chat, still want to at least keep my sanity, because when I did saying the Earth is flat 10,000 times, I was not okay. Start, bish, I won't be on, I won't be on for a little. What? You won't be on for a little? Well, you're a bad friend then. Okay, wait. Oh. Are you ready, kids? Alright. Okay. Oh, wait. Just give me one split second. Gonna tweet this out one more time. Just real fast. There was a fighting woods, Matt. Oh, I swear to God, I'll kill you, Steven. I'll kill you. But now, hold on, give me 1 second, then I'll hop on Discord, and we could start. We're live, saying, story, fire, 10,000 times, or until McJuggerNuggets comes in and says hi. And gives me video creating on StoryFire. Oh, I didn't at him. Damn it. Why am I such a disappointment? Pin to pull. No. Hold on. I'm already gonna just start tagging everyone. Okay, I'm hopping on Discord right now, Steven, so we could do this. Okay, bro, can't do that. Okay, Discord's loading right now. And then we'd be good. Okay, let me turn this god-awful music off. There we go, okay. Is the volume gonna load? Why is it not working? Yo.
What's up?
Nothing much.
Am I on your fucking stream?
I mean, your voices, yes.
I have pages over right now, and I can't. We have to get on call later and let me explain to you what happened.
You are such a little bitch.
Yeah, I know.
So is she. Okay, sorry. Okay, you ready, kids? Okay. Ready, set, go. StoryFire. Oh, StoryFire. 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 Fuck. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. I'm gonna kill myself by the end of this, I swear to God. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. Oh my God, I'm gonna be like slurring my words by the end of this. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. Big up StoryFire, StoryFire, StoryFire. Let me put headphones on because I'm gonna kill myself and I can't listen to anything while I'm at it. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. One more time. StoryFire, StoryFire, StoryFire. Hold on, wait. Hold on, this is a running gag. StoryFire, StoryFire, StoryFire. Okay, sorry. Had to be 5 years old for a few seconds. StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 huh? StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. Okay, hold on. I'm gonna probably end my life. I can't listen to anything while I'm at it. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. Well, there's just ads playing right now, so that's like making my mood even worse now. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire. I don't even have water. I emptied one water. That's it. Oh, crap. Well, I didn't get anything to drink, so this is going to be a long few hours. StoryFire, StoryFire, StoryFire. Hold on. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. I'm gonna be going to sleep tonight, and I'm gonna be saying StoryFire in my sleep. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 200, I'm so slow, 200 StoryFires. Oh god, we only have 9,800, 9,800, something like that, I don't know. StoryFire, 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 please talk in chat, or else I'm gonna actually lose my mind. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. Okay. StoryFire, StoryFire, StoryFire. What made you do this? Honestly, oh, I couldn't even tell you. I really couldn't have. I made a joke tweet about it once, like a few days ago, and I tagged McJuggerNuggets in it, the like owner of StoryFire, and he liked it. So you know what? That made me like, hey, I said the Earth is flat 10,000 times on stream, so why don't I do saying StoryFire 1,000 times? Cause I'm not crazy enough. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. We're only at 236 out of 10,000. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. I missed two. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. I think we did. I think I did saying the Earth is flat almost a year ago to the date. Shockingly enough, I want to see if I actually did it almost a year ago. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. No, 8 months ago I did it. Saying Earth is flat 10,000 times. It only took me 2.5 hours, so I want to see if I could beat that. Maybe 2 hours? Maybe, well, I mean, by the way I'm doing it, I just consistently did it on the last one. This, obviously I'm talking to the chat also. And I'm also listening to music so I don't go crazy. Okay. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. If you guys want to check out my StoryFire account, link will be down in the description box below. I said it. Yeah, go StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. Do you have a water over there? Because I'm like about to die now. I have StoryFire up on my TV. Yeah, but I'm literally watching McJuggerNuggets. I'm watching StoryFire up on my TV. Okay. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. What did I get myself into? I'm already just realizing now how insane this is. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire. I wish like it automatically counted for me because I feel like that would be way easier than sitting there trying to click it every time I have to say StoryFire. You're gonna go all night. If I have to, yeah. I'm also like half sick and on various different medical things. I guess I don't know. I'm on some kind of pill and then I'm on some kind of powder. I don't know. I'm dying. So this is not going to be a very fun night for me doing this because I feel like absolute crap. So I couldn't do anything the last 2 days. StoryFire, 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 400 StoryFires. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. I'm already listening to the My Virtual Escape soundtrack from StoryFire. It just happened to pop up. It's the only song that's been playing. Only songs. StoryFire, StoryFire, StoryFire. You could legit see McJuggerNuggets' channel up on my TV. I might even like instead of just sitting here saying StoryFire, StoryFire, like 10,000 times, I might even just kind of just like point the camera at me with the mouse in my hand, just StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. I missed one. And just continue watching that, if anything. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 $500,000 worth of StoryFires. Big up StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. Hold on. Let me get StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. Okay. You're slowly going insane. Oh, you know, 100%, 100%. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. Come back tomorrow morning, 100%. I'm gonna be like 100,000 because I forgot to stop. I'm gonna be at 100,000 by tomorrow morning, only because my dumbass is gonna forget to have stopped. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, StoryFire, StoryFire. StoryFire. I just want to get some good non-copyrighted music up. Okay. StoryFire, 600 StoryFire. Can't wait to get to 666 so that the devil knows, hey, yeah, this guy's next. He's gonna die next by doing this. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, StoryFire, StoryFire. StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. You see, I wish like I could turn my music up all the way and not have the microphone pick me up, because then I just like constantly say it so I don't have to listen to myself, because the main reason I'm gonna go insane is from listening to myself saying StoryFire a billion times. I'm gonna hop on my computer in a second. Okay, go ahead, Christian. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. If you guys haven't already, please like, which one like equals 1 year in the insane asylum. Yeah, that's the level. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. If you guys even want to donate, the link will be down in the description box below to end my suffering, even pay for my funeral. I don't know, by the end of this. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. Sorry, I'm 6. StoryFire, StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. We're almost at 1,000. It's not that bad, to be honest. It's not bad at all. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. Let me just get not playing anymore. StoryFire, StoryFire. Whoops, I turned down the way. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. I'm legit gonna do this. Hold on. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire. Oh, here we go. 1,000. Actually, no, hold on. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. Big up Jonas Brothers. Big up the story. Big up Jonas. What is the sucker I'm listening to? Yeah, something like that. StoryFire, StoryFire, StoryFire. Oh crap. Oh, I wasn't clicking yet. Oh no. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. Alright, I'm here. What's up, Christian? StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. If you haven't already, please like this live stream. Once again, 1 like equals 1 year in insane asylum for me. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. Check the Skyblock base. Yo, I upgraded so much. I would, but I'm too busy going insane. Saying StoryFire 10,000 goddamn times. Yep. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. Even if you want to like go on the server and then take a video of the base and send it to me on Messenger, I'll check it out. StoryFire for at least some kind of entertainment. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. While I'm saying StoryFire 10,000 times, so you could just send me that and I could have something to at least watch. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. Yeah, I haven't been on the Skyblock base in a little while. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. I mean, after, if you have time, hop on Discord and we could play. Yeah, but I don't know how. We're doing to 10,000 or until McJuggerNuggets joins in the stream. So I recommend go share this to him. Go like tweet at him. Go like Insta post and tag him. Do something. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 hang. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. The sad moment, like it's gonna be real sad when I find out that this counter thing doesn't go to 10,000. That's when I'm really pissed. Like if it goes to only 900, or if it only goes to 9,999, I'm gonna be pissed. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. I forgot to count. Oh, click. You see, I'm going insane. I'm literally going insane by doing this. StoryFire, StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. I wasn't clicking. God damn, I don't know which one I was at. Shite. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, StoryFire. Sorry, I'm watching something. StoryFire, StoryFire, StoryFire. StoryFire, StoryFire, StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, StoryFire, StoryFire. Poem Flame. StoryFire, StoryFire. Movie Heat. Shut up, I hate you. I hate you, Let's. I hate you. You're gonna mess me up. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. Oh god. What's up, Let's? StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. You missed it. A very sad moment. I did like, what is it? Maybe like, I couldn't tell you how many. Where I forgot to click the button. So it just wasn't counting every time I said StoryFire. So that really just StoryFire, StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. I just gotta work and I'm here to listen for a bit. Awesome, awesome, man, thanks. Yo, Let's do me a favor. Unsubscribe from my channel, then resubscribe. I wanna see if this works. Unsub, then resub. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. Let's say the same words so many times in a row. It's really hard. It may sound like it's not hard at all. It is so hard. You have no idea. Like, I did this when I said the earth is flat 10,000 times. I said a sentence over and over again. This, I'm just saying a word. StoryFire. My subs are private, it won't work. Oh, that's big. That's big. Oh, that's big gay. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. Well, then make them private, damn it. Why do you want him to unsub? Well, Christian, if your subscriptions are public, unsub, then resub. I want to see if this cool thing works. StoryFire for the sub notification. Yeah, I'm using Streamlabs OBS for the first time ever, and I want to see if that works. I got the donation thing set up, so that's the link for that's down in the description box below. I have that notification set up. I have the subscription, this sub notification thing set up. StoryFire. My ass hurts now. Okay. StoryFire. Christian, then I guess I don't think your subscriptions are public. No, I mean, it's set. Okay, I guess it's just not gonna work. What is this? What am I at? I forgot what I was saying. Oh my god, I'm literally sitting here trying to figure out what I'm saying. StoryFire. I already sat there for a good, minute trying to figure out what I'm saying. Let's, I hate you. Stop that. StoryFire. Focus, damn it. Focus. StoryFire. Everyone tweet this to McJuggerNuggets. At McJuggerNuggets. Because I'm going until I hit 10,000 or until McJuggerNuggets joins the stream. StoryFire. StoryFire. Christian, that means you too. StoryFire. Oh, did you do it? Oh, yeah. Okay, well, no, let's just did it. He just mentioned me also. StoryFire. Big up Blitz. Appreciate that, mate. StoryFire. If you haven't already, please like this stream. For every one like equals 1 year inside an insane asylum for me for doing this. StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. I'm gonna have no voice by the end of this. Tweet it out. Yeah, appreciate that. Let's. I saw it. Big up the Let's. Big up the Let's. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. Oh, whoops. I just busted my eardrums. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 Story. I forgot to hit it again. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. Yeah, I'm glad you are doing what you love. Yeah, I love doing this. I love it. Oh, StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. This hurts. This hurts to do this. You have no idea. Oh, it hurts my voice. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. I want to hit 2,000 StoryFires by an hour. I have 9 minutes left to get this done. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. Nah, it's playing, so I took my headphones off. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. But I hate listening to myself, so I'm putting them back on. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. I'm listening to a song called by Jacksepticeye called "What Is My Life," which is exactly what I'm questioning myself right now. What is my life? Because I'm doing this. Why? What is my life? StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. If I hit 2,000 StoryFires before 1 hour, I'm gonna punt good old Walrus over there. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire.
You're getting ready for a night out.
StoryFire, 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 StoryFire.
But you're ready to let loose.
StoryFire, Fire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. They got 2,000
On
StoryFires.
demand. Get 1 month on us. Terms and conditions apply.
Get out of here. Okay. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire is gonna be big in 2020. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. What was the Wallace from Sewing Class? Was that Wallace? Yeah, it was. It was. StoryFire, StoryFire, StoryFire. I still have that piece of garbage. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. I still have mine, Will. Well, do you? What did you do? Did you do a Wallace too, or did you do something else for sewing class? StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. So I'm listening to the Friends theme song now. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. Okay, well. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. Oh, you did a penguin? Ah, it's sick. I forget what the options were, but I think I was originally gonna do this like deformed, random like anime guy, like random cartoon guy. And then they all yelled at me because they all want to do it as a friend group, but but I guess they all hate me, so I was told to do something else, so I got switched out with that one. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. This is not only one say word 10 times, but also clicking 10 times. Yeah, it's very obnoxious. I wish I had a trackpad, because then I just keep clicking, because I accidentally keep, like, once in a while missing it, and then I'm not counting a lot of them. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, StoryFire, StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. Wait till we get to 5,000 StoryFires. That's when it gets real. That's when I have a plan. That's when I gotta get geared up to do the final 5,000. StoryFire, StoryFire, StoryFire. Oh, StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. I wish I was able to like click the space bar. I feel like that'll be a lot easier. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. Sounds like you still hate fires. StoryFire, still hate fires. Still hate StoryFire. Aha! Oh no! You're messing me up. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. Sorry, my thing's messing up. StoryFire. This shows what a great friend Christian is. He's still here, an hour in, listening to me say the same word for over 2,500 times. StoryFire. StoryFire. Yeah, I'm playing Skyblock while you're doing it. Ha! StoryFire. Well, I praise you. I don't want people to praise me for doing this. I want people to praise you for listening to me doing this. StoryFire. Oh, crap. StoryFire. Oh, I forgot to click. God damn it. StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 3,000 StoryFires! Oh, 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 3,000 StoryFires! I did 3,000 StoryFires in under an hour and 10 minutes. Wow. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. It looks like I'm dying. Because this bright light's blasting on my face. It literally looks like my life force is being faded out of my body. StoryFire, StoryFire, StoryFire. Oh, I forgot to click. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, StoryFire, StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. Hold on. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. I gotta whip the whips. Whoops. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. My voice is literally going. I'm not even kidding. This is me talking normally. Okay, that's not good. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, StoryFire, crap, I accidentally exited off of Spotify. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, StoryFire, StoryFire. Would you look at that? Thank you for subscribing. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. I don't remember who that was. RJ Foth, thank you so much for subscribing. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. You got this, Matt. Hopefully. Just wait. Once I hit 5,000, that's when things are gonna get serious. That's when we're gonna go take this thing down. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, StoryFire, StoryFire. StoryFire, StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. I gave up on listening to music because I got too many ads, so I'm watching Netflix right now. I'm watching The Marlon Show. Best show ever. StoryFire. It's literally YouTube. It's literally a YouTuber. Marlon Webb. StoryFire. Not Marlon Webb, no, StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. Oh god, StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. 3800. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, StoryFire, StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. I'm sorry I'm laughing. I'm literally in the middle of watching that Marlon show. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, StoryFire. I forgot I was streaming for a second. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 4,000 StoryFire. Oh God. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. I'm debating on doing up to 5,000 and then ending it there, and then part 2 will be the final 5,000. Maybe. I don't know. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. I'm literally gonna go brain dead by the end of this. Legend. I don't know about that, Alex. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. I'm only an hour and a half in, and I'm already just about finished with 2 waters. Correction, I'm finished with 2 waters. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. I'm literally going insane. Oh my God, this is bad. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. Okay, time to fucking put it in maximum overdrive. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. Make it to 5K. You got this, Chief. I know. I have to. I was just saying. I'm debating on doing up to 5,000, then ending it there, and then part 2 or something. Do another 5,000, or something like that. I don't know. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, StoryFire, StoryFire. Hold on. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, StoryFire, StoryFire. Well, man, it sounds like you're saying fire story sometime. Really? StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. 4300 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. Hold on. Let me quickly see something real fast. Sorry about that. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. 4444. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 4500 StoryFire. 4500 StoryFire. 500 left to 5000. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, StoryFire, StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 Story. Yo, I hope McJuggerNuggets joins. Yeah, same here, mate. Take care, man. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. Come on, mate, you can do this. Yeah, I know. I'm just trying to get to 5,000, and then I could do part 2, the other 5,000, some other time when I'm not physically dying. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. Come on, 10 more, 10 more. We got this, 10 more. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. StoryFire, 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 StoryFire. Oh my god. Oh Nelly. Oh. Okay, well, there goes not my sunglasses. Where the other lens go? I don't know. Okay. Wow. 5,001 StoryFires. Thank you guys so much for watching part 1 of my McJuggerNuggets video live stream, I guess. Oh god. Oh. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Well, thank you guys so much for watching this live stream. If you haven't already, please subscribe for more content. All the links, including the donation and StoryFire, will be down below. Just my next video if you all enjoy it. And I love you guys to death. Don't forget to download StoryFire. Stay green.